Yet another day of awesome chess in Bucharest, Romania has come to an end. This was round 7, a really fantastic day, high quality chess, high quality drama, and the game between Alireza Firouzja and Lenier Dominguez did not disappoint. I mean, I literally jumped out of my chair when Alireza found a certain move. This was just awesome, time scramble stuff, and when he slammed it down on the board, the engines were going nuts, the commentators were going nuts. He found the move. This is high quality chess, you've got to see this one. So Alireza kicked off with pawn d4, Lenier went knight f6, we had pawn c4, e6, the start of the Nimzo-Indian potentially. Alireza obliges with knight c3, bishop b4 pins that knight, and now pawn to e3. Now we're going down a very trendy variation at the moment. So we had castles from black, bishop to d3 from Alireza, and now pawn d5 striking in the centre, kind of taking it back towards Queen's Gambit decline territory, kind of a Ragozin style variation with the bishop on b4. So we had captures on d5, the pawn recaptures, pawn a3 now, putting the question to the bishop. Now white's not afraid if black wants to take there, give up the bishop pair. So the bishop drops back to d6 here, queen c2 from Alireza. And this position's very topical right now. Wesley So, for example, had this exact position earlier in the tournament against Shakhriyar Mamedyarov. Now I covered that game, so I'll link it at the end of this one if you want to check it out. Now there's different ways to play here, of course. Shak went with pawn a6. Here Lenier selects to go for pawn c6. This is what Sam Sevian played against Wesley So in the American Cup a couple of weeks ago. And now knight g to e2 from Alireza. So the knight doesn't come to f3. It's a much more flexible setup here for white. So the rook came to e8 here. Bishop d2 developing, and now pawn b6 from Lenier, so he didn't put the knight on d7, which we saw in a couple of the other games in this line. He just wants to get on with this c5 break, but in response here, Alireza goes super aggressive, so he goes pawn f3, standard idea. Lenier goes pawn c5, and now can you guess what Alireza plays here? Trademark move for him, he just chucks that g-pawn, pawn g4 here. Let's go on the king side. He's going after the black king now, not hiding his intentions. He wants to checkmate. So pawn c4 from Lenier. So he closes things on the queen side. Might look counterintuitive to do that when white's attacking you through the centre on the flank, but he wants b4, b5, b4 rather at a later point, maybe supported by a5. So this is his idea. The bishop comes to f5. This one captures here, and now you might think taking with the pawn is best, open the g-file, but actually then you're kind of blocking out your queen. It's going to take a long time to clear these pieces and transfer the queen here, and in the meantime black's going knight c6, pawn b5 and so on. They're going to actually be quicker on the queen side. So the queen recaptured here instead, pawn g6 kicked it, the queen came to g5. Both players playing quickly at this point, they were in their preparation, and now knight c6 developed, and Alireza actually just castled here, just to show you, by the way, if he tries to get really caveman on this and go pawn h4, well, you're kind of boxing in the queen here, so you can actually go king g7, threatening h6, say h5 comes, well then h6 anyway, kicks the queen back, then g5, queen f2, and you've actually closed down the king side there, and once again black's now going to be coming at you through the centre on the queen side, so you have to be a bit careful, play precisely, you can't go too caveman. So castles was played instead. Now the bishop came back to f8, looking to support those dark squares around the king. And now a really nice nudge back from Firouzja. He goes queen h4 here, preparing pawn g5 in many of the lines. So pawn h6 was played, preventing that one. Rook a to d1 was played, overprotects that d pawn here, prepares to play e4 in the future. And now pawn b5 from Lenier, he gets on the queen side, an excellent move, and you can't go capturing this pawn, or then the rook comes to the b file. There's big counterplay here against the b2 pawn. So that's why the knight didn't actually take on b5 here, but the very big consideration now for Alireza is should he go pawn e4. Now he looked at this line, and in the post-game interview, this is what he showed, and this is why he didn't play it. So after captures here, you would take on h6 with the bishop, but then there's this knight h7 move, a very good defensive maneuver, opens up these queens staring at each other. Now if you want to avoid the queens coming off, keep the attacking chances, you'd nudge that one back, but then captures here, queen recaptures, takes on f3, rook takes, and then queen g5. And this is the problem, that black's kind of forcing the queens off, or you have to go queen h3, but then are you really attacking anymore? So this isn't what Alireza wanted, and this is why he didn't play that pawn e4 move. Instead, he just sat on the position here. He nudged his queen back with queen f2, and this holds the latent threats of that e4 stuff. We can see there's a battery lined up here, for example, down the f file, and that's why we had queen d7 here from Lenier. So he overprotects this f7 pawn, because in some lines when that knight's coming to e4, when the pawn's coming to e4 rather, he wants to be capturing back with the knight, but then this pawn is now protected. So now we had queen g2 from Alireza. He nudges to the side here, again preparing pawn e4, but bishop g7 is a good response from Lenier. Now pawn e4 is not working, critically because after captures here, pawn recaptures, this knight is now protected by the bishop because it's attacked by the rook, as we can see, and so black's actually got time to pick up on d4 here, the knight's protected. This is the problem, this is why you can't go e4. So what did Alireza do instead? Well, he went for the other very aggressive pawn push in the position, pawn h4 here, threatening g5. Once again, he wants to rip open the h file, go after the black king. So knight e7 was now played by Lenier. He's now anticipating g5, then he wants to put a knight on this juicy f5 square, plus the queen now holds the b5 pawn, and so you can actually look at going pawn a5 and then b4. So knight f4 now from Alireza, again threatening g5. Now he covers the h5 square with the knight. He stops any hops in here. Pawn a5 from Lenier. And now this knight dropped back to e2, anticipating b4. And really the best move here for black was some kind of defensive measure. So you could go knight to h7, as I'm highlighting there. You could go rook to a6, looking to defend across that 6th rank. You could go rook e to b8, threatening b4. Now what Lenier does is queen b7, again threatening that b4 push, but it's not so accurate because you're moving a defender away now from your king side here, and that's dangerous when you're being attacked. So g5 from Alireza, he gets on with his plan. The pawn captured here, the pawn recaptured, and now knight h7 is again the computer's preferred move, then coming into the f8 square, but Lenier went for the much more human knight d7 here, and Alireza now goes king f2, really aggressive move. He wants to mate black down the h file here. So pawn b4 played by Lenier, rook h1, and now here Lenier makes a mistake. His best was to try for something like pawn c3, then after captures you could take here, for example, try and get some counterplay, but white's still better. But what he does instead is go knight to f5. Now it looks so logical, hitting that lovely square, opening up the rook, pressuring this pawn, but here's the big problem. Queen h3 played very quickly by Alireza. He's so tactically aware. And the trick here is that now if you played something like, say, pawn to c3, getting on with your own plans, well, we could capture here, say you take here like in the other line. Well, now we check on h7, the king moves away, and here's the trick. Knight to h5, beautiful tactical stuff. And you can't take this one, or the queen takes on f5, and your whole position is just getting ripped apart. The knight's coming into f4, pawn g6, the rook's coming in on the h file. It's just a complete collapse for black. So Lenier realized this after Alireza went queen to h3 here. Let me hop it back here. Queen h3. Literally his only move now is to actually drop the knight meekly back to e7, recognize the mistake, but now Alireza can bring another piece into the attack. So Lenier is under pressure here. He goes rook a6, trying to defend across that 6th rank, and now Alireza takes on b4. the pawn recaptures. He can't actually crash through on the king side yet, so he turns his attentions here. He picks up that pawn on b4 and he's deflecting the defender of this knight here. So after the queen recaptures, he takes on d7, he's won a pawn, and instantly you're probably thinking, well, why isn't black taking here with check? And you can do this, but after the knight blocks the check, the problem is that your rook is still attacked. So say you defend like this, well then there's rook b1, the counter attack comes. And although the computer gives this as level, we can see that this is really scary for a human player, especially when you're in time trouble. So Lenier didn't want any part of this. After the queen took on d7, he first played the rook here, defended his rook, and now Alireza went knight f to e2 already, anticipating the dropping of that b pawn. Lenier went rook d8, kicked the queen back to g4, and then he did take this pawn, because now at least he's kicked the queen off the 7th rank for white. So queen f4 was now played by Alireza, and this is such a tricky move, setting up a beautiful tactical shot here, and Lenier misses it, so he goes knight c6, moving a defender away from his king. And now Alireza finds this amazing move with 1:20 on his clock. Can you find the move here? I'll give you a few seconds, pause the video if you want to. So he plays rook on h7, slams it down. Now you can't capture that one, or then the queen takes on f7, and this is just deadly. The rook's coming to the h-file, in combination with this pawn and queen, that's just dead, it's mate in 3. So you cannot capture that rook, it's completely immune, and the big problem here, just to show the threat, is say you go pawn c3 or something, well then you're capturing on g7, king recaptures, queen f6, you're just getting completely boxed in here, and when the rook comes to the h-file, threatening mate, this is the key thing, your knight left e7, so there's no knight g8 here to hit the queen, cover the king, and that's why you're just dead in the water in this whole position. So the rook's immune, you can't just push c3 and ignore it all, so Lenier found the only move to stay in the game here with literally 1 second on his clock. They do get 30-second increment a move though. He went rook to e6, covering that f6 square from the queen invasion. So now Alireza has to switch tactic. He wants to bring a heavy piece to the h-file, and he sees the best way to do this is with queen h4. Now again, black can't get too complacent. Say you go pawn c3, well we're taking on g7, king recaptures, queen h6 check, and once again we're mating like this. It's just unavoidable. If you go f5, well we crash down like this, the rook mates along the 7th rank. So you can't get casual, you can't go pawn c3. This is why Lenier had to take on d4, give that knight, and what he does here as well is open up the defense of the queen down here. So Alireza now took on g7, the king recaptured, and now you can't go in for this same stuff with check. Then after the king moves, although it looks like this is mating, knight takes on e2 is the problem. The queen covers that h8 square from afar, really beautiful defense. This is no good for white, black is actually winning. So instead of going for that mating attack, after takes on g7, king recaptures, Alireza now just takes on d4 with check. He forces the queens off, but after the king recaptures here, this endgame is just completely busted for Lenier because that structure's completely weak. His rooks are tied down defending it, so this is now just a matter of technique. So the rook defended the pawn again, the knight came to c3, we had f6 from Lenier, captures here, the king marched in, but now the other knight's coming around, it's coming into f4. If you try and block it, by the way, with g5, well then e4. This is a massive problem. If you take, we take with the knight, we're hitting with check, otherwise we're going to win your pawn. So really tough for Lenier, not much he can do. He goes pawn e5, Alireza goes rook g4, clears the d4 square for his knight, pressures here, Lenier defends, knight d4, rook d7. Lenier is completely paralysed, of course. We had a check here, king f6, pawn f4. This one now came back to the d-file, rook e5 from Alireza, and it's not to say that these are all the most precise moves, but white can really do what he wants here. There's so much time on the position. So king f7 played, rook g5, Rook to h8 now, Lenier tries to get active. Alireza goes knight f3, covers the square, also looks at e5. So king g7 played, rook g1 now from Alireza, so he wants to swing all the way around, change the angle of attack here. So rook b7, rook a1, the rook came back to d8, covers this pawn, knight d4 here, watch out for these tricky knights, threatening checks. So rook d to d7 was played, rook a5, pressures that pawn again. Now Lenier tries to get a bit active, he goes g5, trying to open lines. Alireza kicks on with f5, rook b2 check, king f3. This one now came to d2, but again it's all just smoke and mirrors, because after knight takes on d5, pawn c3, Alireza didn't even capture this one, he just went knight e6 check, and here Lenier threw in the towel, he'd had enough. Really, wherever the king goes, you're in trouble. I mean, say you come here, try and hold this pawn, well now you can even go rook a1, threaten this checkmate here. If you go rook h2 to block, then there's knight f6, you hit the rook, you threaten forks, it's just completely game over. So well done to Alireza, he gets a win, he takes his score to 50% now for the tournament, and he's in 4th position, so he's only a point off the leaders. He is doing well here. Thanks very much for watching this video, and I'll see you again tomorrow.